He lost his wife the very night he became a father. She showed up out of nowhere, with a suitcase, worn-out boots, and a past no one talks about out loud. Winter felt endless. The wind cut through your breath, and the silence in the house hummed like an empty church. But it was in that very silence that something unexpected took root, a new life. Warm, simple, real. Welcome to Heartland Stories. I'm Ethan Hale, and here I share true stories about honor, kindness, and quiet strength. Today, I want to tell you about John Miller, a man who buried his wife and nearly buried with her everything still alive inside him. And about Ellie Mae, a woman who wasn't looking for love, but found it anyway, somewhere between winter, firewood, and quiet glances. This isn't a story about miracles. It's about two people, worn down, scarred, who made a choice, not to give up and not to run. Ready to find out how silence can be the answer you've been waiting for your whole life? Then hit that like button and let's begin. The ground lay beneath the snow, deaf, white, still. The branches along the creek looked like dried-up veins on the body of a sleeping land. And only one figure moved in that frozen canvas, slow, steady, like the shadow of something long gone. John Miller walked the fence line, not in a hurry, almost like he was holding himself back. Each step cracked the frozen crust like it was marking time, not distance. He wasn't really checking the fence. He was just reminding himself he was still here, still walking this land. He wore an old canvas coat, patched up like the life he lived. The wind tugged at its hem, crept down his collar, but he didn't flinch. His face wasn't old, not really, but his eyes. They looked like a man who'd seen good things slip away and learned not to expect new ones. The house stood behind him, hunched under the weight of memory. Smoke from the chimney rose thin and hesitant. Inside, in a rocking chair too big for her, sat Betty, his daughter. Tiny girl, tight braid, stuffed bunny in her lap. She didn't look scared, but she didn't look happy either. She looked patient. The kind of patient only kids know, kids who learn too early that sometimes all you can do is wait. John came back at dusk, brushed snow off his shoulders, habit, not thought. Rifle by the door, not as a warning, just part of the rhythm. He nodded to Betty. She gave him a faint smile. He tried to return it, dry, a man's kind of smile, more reflex than warmth. Lit the lamp, tossed a log into the fire. The house creaked. It remembered, too. Reminders were everywhere. An apron hanging by the pantry. The faint smell of lavender in the blankets. The quiet where her voice used to be. Marilyn had died 2 years back. Blood. White sheets. Hands slipping out of his grip. The midwife's prayer, soft, too soft to reach heaven. Since then, every day had become the same. Snow. Chickens. Silence. Repeat. He didn't yell. Didn't drink. He just got quieter. That was his grief, Not in shouting, but in slowly backing away from the world. And Betty. She held on. She talked to her bunny, wiped the floor, fed the birds. Like some part of her childhood understood. If someone, anyone, keeps speaking, then maybe the silence doesn't win. That night, they ate soup. Thin, plain. The kind you sip more out of habit than hunger. The clink of spoons on ceramic was the only sound. John stared out the window. Out there, just wind, snow, and the dark. And tomorrow looked no different. Until fate came knocking. When Betty curled up under her patchwork quilt and the fire settled into a low, steady glow, John made his way to the small writing desk by the window. He sat down slowly, like he wasn't quite sure why. Pulled open the bottom drawer. Among old receipts, spare buttons, and the rustle of time, there it was. A letter. Neatly folded. Every crease holding a pause that once mattered. The paper had yellowed, same as his resolve. He touched it gently, like it might crumble under his fingers. Unfolded it. Ma'am. My name is John Miller. I'm a widower. I have a daughter. We live 3 miles south of Elm Creek. I don't need a maid. And not a saint. Just someone kind. Someone who isn't afraid of quiet. He wrote that 2 years ago, on a night when loneliness pressed so hard, it felt like it could choke him. When the silence in the house didn't feel empty, it felt loud. Back then, he needed something. Anything. That wasn't just his own movement in a room. But the letter was never mailed. To who? For what? Who would come to a place where nothing grows but memory? He read it again. The words felt like they came from someone else. A man he barely remembered. A man who still had a little hope left. He folded the paper carefully, laid it back in the drawer, and closed it. No sigh. No sorrow. Just closed it. Outside, the wind howled like it had lost something. And John sat there in the dark, feeling night close in. Not the kind outside. The kind inside. It was past midnight when the barking woke John. Clyde, his old half-deaf dog, rarely made a sound anymore. But now he barked. Sharp. Almost surprised. John sat on the edge of the bed. The floor was cold, same as the air. He pulled on his boots, grabbed the lantern from its hook on the wall, and stepped outside. The barn stood a little ways off from the house. Dark, alone, framed by trees that shivered in the wind. The lantern swung in his hand, throwing long, twisted shadows across the snow. Clyde met him at the door, tail wagging slow, like he wasn't sure, should he guard or greet. John pushed the door open. Inside, it smelled of hay, frozen dirt, and old wood. The lantern's light drifted across harnesses, a bucket of feed, the mare in her stall. And then, it landed on a figure in the far corner. A woman, curled up, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that didn't belong to her. The dog lay beside her, like he was standing watch. She opened her eyes slowly. Not scared, just tired. The kind of tired that goes deeper than fear. "I'll go," she whispered, before he could speak. Her voice was cracked, cold, or quiet, or maybe both. John stepped closer, lowering the lantern so the light wouldn't blind her. "You know whose place this is?" She nodded. Didn't mean to trespass, just needed to get out of the wind. Her coat was thin, gloves worn through, boots soaked through with melting snow. A leather satchel lay beside her, scuffed and bound with a belt. Still, even sitting on the frozen floor of a stranger's barn, she held herself upright. She wasn't begging. She was explaining. Her eyes were clear, tired, but proud. "What's your name?" "Ellie Mae." "You from town?" "No. Came in on the train. Got off 2 days ago. Been walking ever since." He looked at her, and in that moment, there wasn't recognition, but something like it. A sense of knowing. Two people burned in the same places, still standing in others. "Where were you headed?" "Looking for John Miller." A pause. The lantern in his hand trembled, just a little, like the wind had nudged the truth too close. "You found him," he said. She nodded again, slower this time, like the words meant more than they seemed to. "I had a letter," she said. "From him. From you. It said you were looking for someone kind. Someone who's not afraid of quiet." A pinch struck deep in John's chest. "I never sent it." She smiled a little, crooked, worn out, but real. "Maybe the Lord sent it for you." He didn't know what to say to that. The words hung in the cold air, like breath that hadn't settled yet. She looked down, brushed straw from her skirt. "I'll be gone by sunrise. Just needed to warm up for a bit." He studied her. The way she spoke like rejection was normal. Expected. "Doesn't sit right. Someone sleeping in a barn," he finally said. "Come inside. There's fire. And soup." She looked up, surprised for the first time. "I don't want to be a burden." He shook his head. "You're here now? Might as well step in. Get out of the wind." She stood up. Quietly. Without a word. Clyde rose beside her, loyal to anyone who smelled of need. They walked through the snow in silence. The house ahead gave off a soft, steady light. John let her in first. Led her to the fire. Poured a bowl of soup. She ate slowly. Not like she was starving, just like someone who appreciated warmth. Afterward, he showed her the guest room. A wooden rocking horse near the wall. A quilt that still carried the scent of memory. He stood in the doorway, not sure if he was supposed to say something. She looked at the bed, ran her hand over the fabric. "Thank you," she said. Simply. He nodded. And when he lay down in his own bed that night, the wind outside sounded different. For the first time in a long while, John Miller wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about someone who'd stayed. Not close, but close enough. They sat across from each other at the table. Between them, a deep bowl of warm soup, the scent of cornbread, and a silence that didn't need filling. Ellie ate slowly, the way people do when they know the value of every spoonful. Her movements were steady, quiet. Not like a guest. more like someone who hadn't been home in a while. John didn't ask, and she didn't explain. He just set the bowl in front of her, poured the tea, slid the salt a little closer. Not like a host, but like a man who remembers what it means to care. The fire in the hearth crackled. The dog curled up between them on the warm floor. No words, no lingering glances, but it was clear. They both knew the sound of being alone, and for a little while, they let themselves forget it. When she finished her soup, he stood first. Come on, I'll show you where you can rest. He opened the door to a small room. The lamp's glow caught a hand-carved wooden horse, an old mirror in a worn frame, and a quilt stitched with care. Ellie paused in the doorway. The room breathed quiet, but it carried memory too. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender. The windowsill, just a trace of soap. She didn't ask, didn't say, was this her room? She simply nodded, stepped inside, and set her bag gently in the corner. Ran her hand along the headboard, soft, almost like an apology. Thank you, she said again. Softer this time. He didn't reply, just lingered a second longer at the door, then pulled it closed behind him. The silence in the house now felt different. Not dead. Waiting. The snow kept falling, lazy, like even winter was tired of itself. And Ellie stayed. First for a day, just until the wind let up. Then another, because Clyde had warmed to her, curling by her feet. After that, no one counted. One morning, John found her in the kitchen, warming up oatmeal. She hadn't asked. She just moved like someone who knew. When there's work to do, you do it quiet and with respect. Betty came out rubbing her eyes, stopped in the doorway like she didn't recognize the house. Ellie turned and smiled, soft, without trying too hard. The girl stood there a moment, then walked over, took a spoon, and sat down. By evening, the two of them were out feeding the chickens. Ellie didn't talk to Betty like she was a kid. She just talked. And Betty answered, cautiously at first, then with a little more trust. She showed Ellie her doll, the one that never spoke. Ellie gently fixed its dress and said, "You take good care of her." John saw it from the porch and didn't step in. He wasn't used to movement that didn't lead to loss. Out in the barn, they fixed the gate together. Ellie held the nails, focused, quiet. She didn't hover, didn't talk much. She was just there when needed. And in that silence, once sharp like a blade, something else began to take shape. Softness. Spaces you didn't want to fill with words. That evening, when Betty climbed into Ellie's lap with a book, John paused in the doorway. He didn't want to interrupt. He just wanted to remember this. This forward motion he hadn't asked for. But somehow, it came anyway. No one called Ellie a guest. And no one said she'd stayed. She just hadn't left. It was late afternoon when John found Ellie out on the porch. She stood leaning on the railing, eyes fixed on the trees, like she was reading something hidden between the branches. The wind tugged at her hair, but she didn't brush it back, just let it move. He came up beside her. "How do you know where to find me?" he asked, eyes still forward. She ran her fingers along the rough grain of the wood. "There's a woman runs an agency in Springtown. She keeps a box full of letters that never got answered. Yours was in there." John tightened his grip on the railing. "I never sent it." "I know," she nodded. "She said you wrote it, but must have changed your mind." The letter waited for a reply and got silence instead. Ellie smiled. "Just barely." She handed it to me and said, "You're not afraid of quiet. Maybe you're the one." John looked at her for the first time during the conversation, not like a guest, but like a reply that showed up before the question was even spoken. "You came here without knowing who I was, or what was waiting for you." "I wasn't looking for a man, John," she said softly. "I was looking for a place, somewhere I could be useful, where silence wasn't a punishment, but a choice, where no one asked why I didn't go back." He didn't answer right away, just nodded. The pause between them was long, but it wasn't heavy. Ellie looked back toward the trees. "I knew I wasn't hoping for a miracle, but I thought maybe someone out there would write not for an answer, but for hope. And if I found a house like that, I'd step in quiet and just start helping, living." John watched her, like something inside him was slowly settling, like frozen ground finally ready to grow again. "That letter. I wrote it on a night I thought I was shouting into nothing," he said. "And you came out of that nothing, but not with pity, with an answer." She didn't reply, just gave a slight nod, and he stayed there beside her, saying nothing. And that beside meant more than any words ever could. The next day, they fixed the porch step together. John held the board, Ellie hammered the nails, 2 clean strikes, steady hands. They worked in silence, only the mare crunching hay behind the barn and sparrows digging through leftover snow. When the last nail sank in, Ellie crouched down, wiped her palm on her skirt, and said quietly, "I used to work at a store in Brownsville. The owner was an older man, kind, at first. Then his wife got sick, and he changed." She didn't look at John. She looked down, like the truth sat easier in the dirt. "At first, he asked me to stay late. Then it was dinner. Then he started standing too close. Too often." John didn't move, just gripped the hammer tighter. "I told him no. Told him that's not what I was there for. Next morning, I was fired. Said I was ungrateful. Said all he offered was help." Ellie's fingers curled slightly. Then came the whispers. That I was coming on to him, that I suggested things. I was renting a room in someone's attic. Landlady said I wasn't stable anymore. Told me to leave. Her tone stayed even, almost flat. But every pause felt stretched, tight, like a string pulled to breaking. I figured if I stayed, it'd only get worse. There was a train going north. I took it. There was nothing left to lose. John sat down beside her on the bottom step. He didn't say a word. Didn't try to explain it away. Didn't say, "That happens," or offer advice. He just sat there. And that was enough. "Here," she said finally, "no one touches me. Not with their eyes. Not with their words. I can breathe. I can just live. And that's enough for me." John looked at her. "This isn't a place for crossing lines. Not because we're afraid, but because we understand the value of space." For the first time in the whole conversation, Ellie looked him in the eye. "Thank you," she said, plain and quiet. Then she picked up the hammer again and went back to fixing the porch, like someone starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, a house could have steady steps again. Winter still clung to the land. But inside John's home, it was warming. And not just because of the fire. Ellie started waking up earlier than everyone. Quiet, nearly invisible. She never asked where things were, she just seemed to know. Soon, the kitchen smelled like eggs in the morning. And there was always a mug of tea on the windowsill. John never remembered to drink it. But he always noticed it was there. Betty grew used to her the way a kitten warms up to a blanket. At first, she only watched. Then, she pulled her chair a little closer. Then as she spoke, "Miss Ellie, do you know how to braid hair?" Ellie nodded. And she braided. Slow, careful. Without unnecessary words. Betty didn't hesitate to ask. And Ellie didn't hesitate to listen. Each day, the house picked up new sounds John hadn't heard in ages. A soft giggle behind the door. The swish of a broom. Whispers of made-up stories told to a stuffed rabbit. Ellie didn't ask for permission. She just picked up a rag and wiped down the dust. Gathered laundry. Sewed up the tear in Betty's sock. And she did it all without waiting for thanks. Like her hands already knew. If something's broken, you fix it. No fuss. No promises. John watched. He didn't call her the lady of the house. Didn't call her a guest, either. He just lived in a home that suddenly felt easier to breathe in. He noticed how she blew out the lamp at night. Checked the curtains so no draft crept in. How she always left the last piece of bread untouched. How she never rushed the girl. Even when Betty was lost in her toys. Ellie didn't replace Marilyn. And she didn't try to. She didn't touch the things that had belonged to her. But in everything she did, she seemed to say, "I'm not here to erase the past. I'm just offering you the present." The first time Betty hugged Ellie, it was quick, tight, and out of nowhere. Ellie froze, like she didn't quite believe it was real. Then she gently placed her hands on the girl's shoulders and said softly, "Thank you, sweetheart." Betty, without looking up, muttered, "You've got kind hands, just like Mama did." And off she went. Ellie didn't cry. But later that evening, as she washed the dishes, the soap bubbles lingered a little longer in her hands, shaking ever so slightly. And John, he sat out on the porch, watching dusk settle over the land. He wasn't thinking about love. He didn't call it that. But he knew this. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone in that house was breathing beside him. And that changed everything. Everything. Quietly. Slowly. But surely. They were sitting by the fire. Betty had already curled up, fast asleep, wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. The house breathed slow and deep. The fire crackled softly, like the voice of an old man telling a bedtime story. On the table, the tea had gone cold. Ellie was mending Betty's mitten, calm, focused, unhurried. John sat nearby, in his chair. A cup in his hands he hadn't sipped from in an hour. The silence wasn't heavy. It was thick and warm, like a wool blanket pulled up over both of them. Then he spoke. "You ever been married?" Ellie didn't look up, just let out a quiet breath. Almost. He waited. He was a schoolteacher. Gentle. Quiet. Said he wanted a simple life. Then she added. Later said I'd grown dull. That time had passed and I'd aged with it. She paused. He left. Never waited long enough to buy the rings. Her voice was steady. No bitterness. But John could feel the emptiness in it. The kind scorched by expectations that never came true. He was a fool, John said. Ellie gave the faintest smile. Maybe. Or maybe he just wanted something I never was. Silence settled again. The fire cast orange shadows that danced across the ceiling. I didn't come here expecting anything, John, she said at last. I wasn't looking for a husband or a role to fill. I came because you were kind. He looked at her. And before he could stop himself, the words came. You reminded me I can still feel. She looked up. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled. But both of them knew. Something between them had shifted. Not love. Not yet. But closeness. Delicate. Real. He reached out, took her empty cup, and set it next to his. Their hands brushed. Thank you, he said softly. She didn't answer. Just kept stitching. But now, her hands moved a little gentler. And her breathing. A little steadier. Dr. Hobbs showed up just before noon. No warning, as always, like a man who somehow knows the right time to appear. His wagon cut narrow tracks through the snow, and he stepped inside, brushing frost off his hat like someone who carried not just medicine, but truth. Betty's coughing, he asked, already eyeing the girl. A little, Ellie replied. Mostly in the mornings. The doctor nodded, reached into his bag, and set a small bottle on the table. Give her a teaspoon at bedtime. The rest, love and warm milk. He looked at Ellie, squinting just enough to mean something. Then turned to John. Looks like you're not alone anymore. John said nothing, just pressed his lips together. When Ellie stepped into the kitchen to pour him some coffee, Hobbs leaned in. She the one? From the letter? John nodded. You planning to marry her? I don't know. Well, Hobbs said, if you don't, somebody will. She's not the kind folks overlook. He didn't say it like a warning, but there was something in his voice. Not just an opinion, but a knowing. Like he'd seen what happens when a moment passes you by and doesn't come back. That evening, after Betty had gone to sleep and the doctor's wagon had rolled away down the road, John found Ellie in the living room. She was folding laundry. Slowly, with the kind of care folks usually reserve for things more fragile than fabric. He stood in the doorway for a while before he spoke. Doc says I ought to marry you. She didn't look up. That what he said? He said if I don't, someone else will. Ellie folded a shirt and laid it in the basket. And what do you say? John stepped closer. His voice was low, but firm. I say you fixed me. He paused, then added, I don't know what love is anymore. Not sure I even feel it. But I know since you came, this house doesn't feel empty. And neither do I. Ellie didn't answer right away. She sat there for a long second, as if weighing every word in her head. I don't want to be a thank you, John. You're not her. And I'm not asking you to choose. I'm not choosing between. I'm choosing with. She looked up. Her eyes held caution. And something else. Something trying to believe. What if I say I need time? He nodded. I waited out a whole winter. I can wait a little longer. She didn't reply. But she didn't fold the rest of the laundry either. She just sat there, beside him, and didn't leave. Dawn hadn't come yet when John got up. The house was dark and still. He dressed in the half-light, pulled on his coat, buttoned it all the way to his chin. The wind hit his face, but not harsh, almost gentle, like it knew this morning was different. He saddled the mare, checked the harness, and rode toward town. The road was nearly empty, just the sound of breath from the horse and snow crunching under hoof. By the time the sky began to lighten, He was knocking on the door of a small wooden church. The pastor, tired eyes, kind face, opened up in a wool shawl, still half asleep. "I need a ceremony," John said, "before the sun comes up." The pastor squinted at him. "She know. She will." A pause. "Give me 5 minutes." When he got back, Ellie was already up. Her hair was braided. She wore a blue dress and an apron, like it was just any other morning. "You went out," she said quietly. "Had something to do." He stepped closer and set a small box on the table. "I talked to the pastor. He's waiting. Right now. Right now." Ellie looked at the box for a long time but didn't open it. "I don't have a dress, John. You've got yourself. I'm not ready for a parade. There won't be one. Just you, me, and Betty. Everything else is noise." She looked at him, hands tight together. "You sure?" He nodded. "Never been more." A pause. "You don't have to say yes. But if you want to, we can just be. Not perfect, but real." Ellie opened the box. Inside, a plain silver ring, no stone, polished bright. She exhaled, like letting go of something she'd been carrying for years. "I'm no angel, John. I'm no saint. I need more than shelter. I need to be seen. I see you." Betty sat between them in the wagon, in her nightgown and boots pulled over thick wool socks. She held Ellie's hand. Didn't ask. Didn't look surprised. She just was. The church was empty. Inside smelled of wood and candle wax. The pastor stood at the altar, holding a lantern. There weren't many words. "Do you come here of your own free will?" "Yes." "Do you promise to walk beside each other, not ahead or behind?" "Yes." "To give not perfection, but honesty?" "Yes." Then John looked at Ellie and said, "I choose you because you saw me when I'd forgotten I was still worth seeing." And she nodded through tears, not like in stories, but like someone who had finally found quiet, real quiet. No clapping, no ribbons, just the three of them, and morning, on the ride home. Betty fell asleep on Ellie's lap, her little hand tucked into a fold of fabric. John drove slow and looked at the woman beside him, not like a blessing, but like a decision, like a root finally taking hold in his long winter. At home, they took off their shoes without a word. He brewed tea. She sat by the fire and let her hair down. When he handed her the cup, their hands met, and in that touch, there was everything. A beginning, a choice, a home. Spring hadn't come yet, but something had shifted inside the house. The walls felt softer somehow. The air seemed to whisper, "This place isn't full of memories anymore. It's full of people." Ellie hadn't changed her habits. She still got up early, still hummed to herself while scrubbing the floor or kneading dough. But now, her voice no longer feared being heard. Betty began calling her simply, "Mama Ellie, can I help you?" Or, "Mama." He dropped a button. And then, one day, just, "Mama." No pause, no question, no dividing line. Ellie froze for a moment, but she didn't correct her. She simply walked over, ran her hand gently over the girl's hair, and said, "I'm right here, sweetheart." John stopped keeping track of how many days it had been since she'd first walked through his door, of how many times he'd wanted to ask, "Are you staying?" Now he just lived, and he knew she'd already stayed. Sometimes he'd catch himself smiling, without realizing. When Ellie laughed, when Betty made up wild little stories for her stuffed rabbit, when the silence in the room felt like a pause, not a void. Ellie never tried to become someone else. She didn't wear another woman's dresses. She didn't stare at Marilyn's photos like they were competition. She didn't ask John to forget, but she didn't let the past call the shots either. She just lived. She made soup, mended gloves, sang lullabies to a little girl. Lullabies with no words, just warmth. And somehow, that was enough. No one in that house was waiting anymore. They were already there. 3 of them, breathing as one. The day was gray, like the sun had changed its mind and decided not to rise. The snow on the ground was softening, but still clung to the earth. Spring was fighting for its place. Ellie sat on the porch sorting beans. Betty played beside her with a rag doll, pretending it was getting ready for a ball. The wagon showed up without warning, rolling silent down the gravel path, like doubt arriving without a sound. The horse was well kept, the harness new. The man stepped down slowly, brushed off his coat, and started walking toward the house. John came out of the barn, saw him, and stopped in his tracks. Ellie looked up. The man stood at the edge of the yard. "Ellie," he said, "didn't think I'd find you like this." She looked at him, calm. "I didn't leave a map." He gave a tight smile, but his eyes were tense. "I heard you were here. I wanted to see for myself. Just to know." "You've seen," she said with a nod. "You can go now." His eyes shifted to the girl. "You got a daughter now?" "She's mine. From the moment she hugged me and didn't ask why I was alone." Betty took Ellie's hand. Ellie held it tight. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he said. "But you could have had more than this. Not here. Not like this." Ellie stood. Slow, steady. No hesitation. "I already have more. I already live better." The calm in her voice hit harder than any shout ever could. He stepped closer. But John Miller was already on the porch. Silent. Steady. Not a threat. Just a presence that wouldn't budge. "He builds walls, Ellie. Not bridges," Jake said. "You need someone with fire in their blood. I need someone who isn't afraid of quiet. Who doesn't leave when things get heavy." She held her gaze on him, unshaken. And he realized. The Ellie he once knew was back in some other town. In a life that no longer fit. This Ellie stood like a root in the ground. And she didn't bend. He turned, climbed into his wagon, and rode off, never looking back. When the dust settled, John stepped down from the porch and came to Ellie. "You all right?" She nodded. "More than I thought I'd be." Betty pressed herself against her. "Mama's not leaving, right?" "No, baby. Mama's here." And inside the house, it smelled like bread, and it was truly, finally, quiet. Evening had settled in. Dinner was cleared. Betty was already fast asleep under her patchwork quilt. Ellie stood at the window. The moon cut silver across the yard. The shadow of a tree swayed on the snow like a slow-moving pendulum. John walked up behind her, quiet. The way he always did. Like he knew how not to break the peace. She didn't turn. Just said. He always found cracks. Even where there weren't any. There aren't any now. I used to think love was someone chasing after you. Someone who begs, yells, asks you to stay. And now I think love's the one who walks beside you. Even in silence. Especially in silence. She turned to face him. "You haven't said much, John. But you didn't turn away when I cried at night. You didn't flinch at my scars. I came here full of cracks myself, Ellie. We both just figured out how not to cut with them anymore." She stepped closer. "I married you before sunrise because I was afraid you'd leave." He nodded. "I asked for your hand because I was afraid to lose you. I didn't know how to hold on to anything alive. I'd lived too long with ghosts. And now," he didn't speak right away, just reached for her hand. "Now I'm not afraid." A pause. "I'm not trying to make this into something it should be. I'm just living in what it is. And if this is love, then I know I feel it." Ellie squeezed his hand. "I don't always know how to be a wife. I don't always know how to be a husband. But you know how to stay close. And so do you." They stood at the window, two people who had lived through more than they said out loud. And who understood now that love isn't loud. It's the quiet you're no longer afraid of. It's the choice you make again, every morning. Spring didn't come all at once. It crept in. Like hope returning after a long, quiet wait. Not with blossoms, but with drops dripping off the eaves. With the smell of damp earth. And then, with a laugh. Light and sudden. From somewhere in the yard, Betty was running through the mud in rubber boots. Her jacket half-buttoned. Her doll swinging in one hand. She didn't care. Just laughed. Because the ground was soft again. And the puddles were made for jumping. John stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. No wide grin, but a warm one. The kind that rises from inside you. When there's nothing left to prove. Ellie came out after her. No boots. Barefoot. She'd kicked them off and stepped straight into the muck. Her toes sank into the wet soil. And she laughed, deep and free, like someone remembering how to feel, with more than just their mind. John watched her. The wind played with her hair, as she turned her face toward him, like toward the sun. Then she looked at him. No words, just a gaze. One that said, "This is me." Not someone rescued, someone found. He stepped out to meet her. No rush. He took off his gloves, reached for her hand, fingers into fingers, Mud beneath, lightness inside. They hadn't saved each other. They just found, in all the stillness, that the fight was over. Now, it was time to simply be together. Betty ran up, hugged Ellie around the waist. "You're all muddy." She giggled. Ellie smiled. "Means I'm standing firm." And John knew. Spring had come, not outside, but into the house, into the heart, into them. If this story touched you, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Let quiet victories like these remind us that kindness and honesty still matter. See you next time, here on Heartland Stories.